heard this evening, actor Don Knotts has died. He was 81 years old. Knotts was best known for his roles as Barney Fife on The Andy Griffith Show and the lovable landlord, Mr. Furley, on Three's Company.
He made 60 million people laugh every Monday night for 5 straight years. He won 5 Emmy Awards. He was called the greatest physical comedian of his generation. But on a cold February morning in 2006, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the man in the hospital bed was losing the fight. His best friend had just flown across the country to whisper his name into an unconscious ear, and his daughter was standing in the hallway outside, bent over in laughter because, even while dying, Don Knotts had managed to do the one thing he never could stop doing.
I'm afraid there won't be any time to educate you men in the proper use of firearms. Somebody could get hurt. You see, if you're not familiar with firearms, these babies can go off.
The room where he left. The room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center was quiet on February 24th, 2006. Don Knotts was 81 years old and barely conscious, his body finally surrendering after a long and carefully guarded battle with lung cancer. He had kept the illness secret from almost everyone. A sick actor cannot get work in Hollywood, and Don knew that rule better than anyone. So he accepted the oxygen tank and kept showing up, because performing was the only life he had ever known. His wife Frances, whom everyone called Francie, was in the room. So was his daughter Karen. And even in those final hours, the man could not stop himself. Karen later told interviewers that her father said something so unexpectedly funny right there while he was dying that she and Francie dissolved into uncontrollable laughter, and Karen had to leave the room. Comedy director Howard Storm told her afterwards that she should have stayed. He said Don would have loved every second of it. Before losing consciousness, Don told Francie he was waiting for the great wizard in the sky to take him away. Then Andy Griffith walked through the door. Andy had flown in from North Carolina the moment he understood how serious things had become. Don was mostly unconscious by then. Andy sat down and spoke to him anyway, because he refused to believe his best friend could not still hear him. He said, "Jess, breathe." Don had told Andy years before that he hated his real first name, Jesse, with a genuine passion. So, of course, Andy used it to every chance he could. Andy watched Don's chest rise. He said, "That's a boy. Just keep breathing." And Don's shoulder moved. Andy believed until his own dying day that Don heard him in that room. The next morning, Andy appeared on television and said, "I lost my best friend." But what the world was never fully told is how Don Knotts arrived in that room, and the real stories of the women who loved him. Most people believe they already know Don Knotts. Almost none of it is completely true. What drove Don Knotts to become the most nervously funny man in America started long before any camera ever pointed at him. It started in a house in West Virginia, where a small boy slept on a cot in the kitchen and prayed every night that his father would not get up from the couch with a knife. The boy on the cot in the kitchen. Jesse Donald Knotts was born on July 21, 1924, in Morgantown, West Virginia, the youngest of 4 sons and entirely Tapoki unplanned. His mother Elsie was already 40 years old when he arrived, and his nearest brother was 14 years older. From his very first day, Don existed at the edges of his own family. The house on University Avenue was small and always struggling. Elsie rented the second floor to university students during the Depression just to put food on the table. Don slept on a cot in the kitchen beside the stove because there was nowhere else to put him. And every time he needed to get from his bed to any other part of the house, he had to walk through the living room. Lying on the couch in that living room was his father. William Jesse Knott was a paranoid schizophrenic and an alcoholic who had suffered a complete mental breakdown before Don was born. On certain nights, he would rise from the couch and find a knife. Don did not consciously remember these incidents until therapy resurfaced them decades later. His mother once asked whether he remembered his father holding a knife to his throat when he was still in nappies. He did not remember, but his body had never forgotten. His father died of pneumonia in 1937 when Don was 13, and his daughter Karen said the moment that happened, an enormous burden lifted from her father, and home finally felt safe. Don discovered laughter through his older brother Shadow, who could turn a dinner table into chaos just by buttering his bread like a violin. When Shadow died young, the fire had already caught. Don built a ventriloquist dummy, performed at local parties, and came home one night with nearly $1 in coins that felt, he said, like a fortune. At Morgantown High School, he became class president and was voted the most popular boy in the school. Then the war came. Don joined the Army and sailed to the Western Pacific, performing comedy for troops. When commanders insisted he keep using his dummy, the dummy mysteriously vanished over the railing of a ship somewhere in the Pacific. Don called it an accident. Nobody believed him. He came home genuinely confident for the first time in his life, enrolled at West Virginia University on the GI Bill, and at a campus sorority mixer one Saturday afternoon, fell completely and helplessly in love. The woman he met that afternoon would follow him to New York with almost nothing, believe in him before the world did, and then be written out of history by one of the most persistent myths ever told about someone who is still very much alive. The woman history buried alive. Her name was Catherine Elaine Metz, and everyone called her Kay. She was a petite freshman, the daughter of a Northern Baptist minister from Wheeling, West Virginia, and she had no idea the nervous young veteran competing for her attention that afternoon would one day win 5 Emmy Awards. Don was immediately certain. They married on December 27, 1947, her birthday, at her father's church. He borrowed $100 from his brother to get them to New York. They arrived with $120 between them and more ambition than sense. The lean years were genuinely lean. Don worked small radio roles and spent years convincing nobody. Kay believed in him anyway, steady when he was spiraling, present every night he came home defeated. Their children, Karen and Tom, were born during those years. The family eventually moved to California, and Don's career broke open through The Steve Allen Show and a phone call that would change television forever. But fame cracked open things that were already fragile. Don grew restless. His daughter confirmed he was quite popular with women during those years. Kay eventually told biographer Danielle DeVise something heartbreaking in its simplicity. She said Don wanted her to understand the life he was choosing. She said, "He wanted me to understand it, but I didn't." They divorced in 1964. Don kept custody of both children. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody has ever publicly corrected. For years, videos and biography articles have repeated the same tragic detail, that Kay Metz died suddenly in 1966 at just 38 years old, and that her death shattered Don. It is emotional. It is also completely false. Genealogical records from Find a Grave, Family Search, and WikiTree all confirm the same truth. After the divorce, Kay married another man in Los Angeles on May 26, 1966. She later divorced him and remarried. She lived in Sacramento well into the 2000s. The myth began when someone mistakenly recorded the divorce finalization date as her death date, and from there it spread unchallenged. The most decisive proof: Danielle DeVise, who wrote the authoritative biography of Don and Andy published in 2015, interviewed Kay Metz directly for the book. A dead woman cannot give a biographer an interview. Catherine Elaine Metz died on September 27, 2018, at approximately 90 years old, outliving Don Knotts by 12 full years. The real tragedy of their marriage is not that she died young. The real tragedy is that the man she believed in most could not hold on to her once he had everything she helped him build. Don Knotts was about to create one of the most beloved characters in television history. But the partnership that built Mayberry was held together by something far more fragile than either man ever admitted. And the day Don walked away became a decision that followed him for the rest of his life. The deputy and the decision that haunted him. In early 1960, Don watched the pilot that would become the Andy Griffith Show and immediately called Andy. He said, "Don't you think Sheriff Taylor ought to have a deputy?" Andy's response was 3 words: "Lord, call Sheldon Leonard." There was no audition. Don walked onto the show because Andy wanted him there. They had met in 1955 during the Broadway production of No Time for Sergeants. 2 Southern boys alone in Manhattan, both shaped by difficult fathers, both using performance to survive. Andy later said those 5 years in Mayberry were the best 5 years of his entire life. The decision that made the show legendary came from Andy himself. He told Don that Barney should be the comic and Andy would play it straight. He voluntarily handed the funniest material on his own show to his best friend. Ron Howard said Andy was in tears from laughing at least once every single week. Don won 5 consecutive Emmy Awards. Every single year he was nominated. But by the 5th season, Don believed the show was ending. Andy had said privately he would not continue. Don signed a movie deal. Then Andy changed his mind. Don later said, "If I had known that Andy intended to go on with it, of course I would have stayed." His heart had already decided before the ink dried. He walked away from the greatest role of his life and spent decades carrying that one mistake. The anxiety that made Barney Fife so brilliantly funny was not a performance at all. It was something Don had been carrying in his body since childhood, and it was quietly tearing apart everything he tried to build in private. The man behind the trembling lip. There is a version of Don Knotts the audience adored, the wide-eyed deputy who fell completely apart at the first sign of trouble. What almost nobody knew was that this required almost no imagination. Don Knotts lived with chronic anxiety his entire life. Anxiety severe enough to keep him in bed for days before a performance. Lifelong hypochondria, chronic insomnia, and depression that arrived without warning. Karen was still a child when she first began coaching her own father through his darkest moments. She said, "I became like a mini shrink. I would try to motivate him not to feel so depressed." His son Tom told Devise, "I am convinced my dad would not have made it without his therapist. He would have committed self-inflicted death or something." The therapy worked, slowly and painfully. Karen confirmed, it took a while for him to break through all of his trauma from childhood, but he did it. Devise wrote that Don spent his entire childhood learning to read his father's face, to notice the smallest shift in body language, to sense danger before it arrived. That sensitivity to how frightened people behave became the foundation of every character he ever played. The real Don Knotts looked nothing like Barney Fife. Ron Howard called him calm, kind, and deeply creative. Betty Lynn, who played Thelma Lou, agreed. A very quiet man, very sweet, nothing like Barney Fife at all. Karen said, "I would stand outside the door and listen to him run his lines over and over. It sounded like a concert pianist going over each bar with different emphasis. His suffering was the raw material. His craft was the instrument. What came out the other side was so singular that Jim Carrey, on the set of The Grinch in full Grinch costume, immediately launched into a full Barney Fife impression the moment he spotted Don on the stage below. Ron Howard said he wished the cameras had been rolling. Even while the laughter continued, a quiet and devastating health crisis was already taking Don's vision and unraveling his second marriage in ways that very few people outside that relationship ever understood. Lauralee, Francie, and the slow unraveling. After his divorce from Kay, Don moved through the 1970s with the restless energy of a man chasing something he could not name. He was charming and lonely in almost equal measure. He married Lauralee Chukna in Hawaii in 1974. Their marriage lasted 9 years. The thing that ended it was not another person. It was a diagnosis. Don was quietly losing his vision to macular degeneration in both eyes. As the darkness crept inward and his sight continued to fail, something inside him fractured completely. Laura Lee told DeVise, "When he started to lose his vision, I think he just panicked. And he started to live out some sort of bucket list. The panic consumed everything." They divorced in 1983. Then, in 1987, on the set of a small sitcom, Don met Frances Yarborough. Francie was decades younger, warm and genuinely kind. She told DeVise, "My first reaction to him was that he was so vulnerable. I had never met someone so vulnerable." She came to help him learn his lines and stayed for the rest of his life, helping him break a dependency on sleeping pills and giving him something close to real peace. They married quietly in 2002. By late 2005, his lungs were failing. Lung cancer and pulmonary fibrosis were working through what remained of his health, and he told almost no one. He kept the secret because he still wanted to work, and he was still Don Knotts, and Don Knotts did not get to be sick in public. In the winter of 2006, he ran out of time. What Andy Griffith said at Don's funeral and what Francie whispered to Andy months later about Don's final words closed a loop that had been opened since two young Southern men met in a Broadway dressing room in 1955. And what it says about real friendship stays with you long after the laughter stops. What Don left behind. Andy Griffith stood at Don's funeral and said, "I take comfort because I know that Don is in paradise." Months later, Francie called Andy on his birthday and told him what Don had whispered near the end about the great wizard in the sky. Andy had privately worried for years whether his best friend would find peace. Those words from Francie landed on him like a gift, and he talked about that phone call for years afterwards. Don was buried at Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, in the same grounds as Marilyn Monroe, Dean Martin, and Rodney Dangerfield. The inscription on his bronze plaque reads, "He saw the poignancy in people's pride and pain and turned it into something hilarious and endearing." Francie chose those words herself. Don won 5 Emmy Awards, every single one for which he was ever nominated. TV Guide ranked Barney Fife the 9th greatest television character ever created. Critics placed his physical comedy alongside Buster Keaton and Stan Laurel. Ron Howard later discovered the two men were distant cousins, a fact neither had known while Don was alive. Howard said Don would have found it very funny. Jim Nabors said the night the news broke, "It is a great loss for our industry, but I love that man dearly, as we all did." Joyce DeWitt said, "Working with Don Knotts was a true gift, pure joy every single moment." In 2016, a life-sized bronze statue was unveiled outside the Metropolitan Theater in downtown Morgantown, the very theater where a teenage Don once worked as an usher. It shows him seated, holding Barney's service cap in one hand and a script in the other. The city had already named a boulevard after him in 1998. Morgantown never forgot. His daughter Karen spent years after his death performing a one-woman stage show about her father, keeping his memory alive in theaters across the country. She said, "Here is the thing about my dad. He had this funniness that was just completely, insanely natural." Natural. That is the word that matters most. A man who grew up sleeping on a cot in the kitchen, tiptoeing past a father with a knife, carrying anxiety in his body for 81 years, transformed all of that private and suffocating fear into something so warm and genuinely funny that 60 million Americans tuned in every Monday night just to watch Barney Fife fall apart. Andy Griffith never fully recovered from losing him. He died 6 years later on July 3rd, 2012. Many who knew both men believe Andy could not find the same joy in life once his best friend was gone. Don Knotts took the worst things that ever happened to him and turned them into the greatest gift he ever gave to the world. Mission fully accomplished, Jesse. That is the real story of Don Knotts, full of truths most people have never heard. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us which part stayed with you the most.